welcome to the Sequoia Park Zoo Conservation Lecture Series. It's so wonderful to see such a full room out there. Thank you all coming and joining us for a lecture on conservation today. My name is Ashley Mobley, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Sequoia Park Zoo Foundation. We are the philanthropic partner of the Sequoia Park Zoo, a nonprofit organization, and we are proud to partner with the Sequoia Park Zoo to bring this lecture series to you all. I'm proud to introduce Dr. Micaela Gunther. She is a professor of wildlife at Humboldt State University.
I've been a professor of wildlife at HSU for the past 12 years, and I study many different mammal species, of which elk is one. I mostly focus on carnivores, and elk are delicious food for carnivores, so they're a great topic of research for my research lab. My colleagues, Dr. Rick Brown and Dr. Tim Bean, could not be here this evening, but they have representatives here from their research areas. Dr. Rick Brown is a disease ecologist professor at the university, and he's been at HSU for about 20 years now, and he has graduate students working on this project. And Dr. Tim Bean is a ecologist, a spatial ecologist at HSU, has been here for 6 years, and also has graduate students on the project. So we're putting together all of our expertise to get work on understanding the ecology of Roosevelt elk. So the other members of our HSU team are Erin Nigon, who's going to be speaking about her population work, and Adam Moore, who's going to be speaking today. We also have Emily Buck here in the audience, who is not quite ready to present today. Her research is still ongoing, so she'll be next. And my student, Rudy Mena, who I will be speaking about his work tonight on his behalf since he is out of the area. And that's our HSU team, and we work very closely with our partners at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, CDFW, and our main collaborator is the elk ecologist, Carrington Hilson. She's been working here for 3 years as the elk biologist for CDFW, and before that came from the state agency in Arizona, working on a whole many different aspects of wildlife ecology, and before that got her master's here at HSU in the Department of Wildlife with Dr. Rick Brown. So we're really happy to have her here, and she's really going to kick off our talk, so I'm really happy to welcome Carrington.
Alright, so elk. A little bit of background for you. There's actually 4 species in North America. So we have Rocky Mountain elk. They exist west of the Rocky Mountains, hence their name. They are the elk that have the largest antler size. Then we have Tule elk. This is really hard. We have Tule elk. They only exist in California, and they're actually the smallest of the subspecies of elk. Roosevelt elk, our favorite. So they extend along the Pacific Northwest, and they're also known as Olympic elk. And they actually have the largest body mass of all of our elk subspecies. And then Manitoban elk, really don't know a lot about those guys. They're in the northern portion of the US and extend up into Canada. So elk in California, historically their range was pretty broad. They covered the majority of our state, and we are pretty lucky because we have 3 species of elk. We have Tule elk, Rocky Mountain elk, and Roosevelt elk. So what happened, initially all of our species were doing pretty well. Rocky Mountain elk were actually in lower numbers. Tule elk, historically, were over 500,000 individuals. By the 1800s, however, the populations had really declined. And for Tule elk, this is one of our great success stories. There was only a handful of individuals left in the San Joaquin Valley. Through reintroduction and a lot of work from the department, we have managed to increase that population, I believe, to over 20 distinct groups and over 5,000 individuals. So our Rocky Mountain elk, if you click back really quick, so you can see they used to be tucked up in the northern part of the state, and they've actually expanded their range and are now headed, I believe, down into Plumas County. You can see how they've expanded, and now we have over 1,500 individuals that we have estimated. And then Roosevelt Elk, they were almost extirpated by the 1800s due to market hunting. And since then, their populations have expanded, and we now have about 6,000 elk in the northern part of the state. So pretty exciting.
Okay, so we're working with our partners, California Fish and Wildlife, and the community. We want to know how many elk there are. That's really one of the main overarching objectives of the project, is to understand not only how many elk there are, but how can we count them all? How can we know how many elk there are? So we have a little bit of natural history here to understand better, how do we get more elk? If we want a greater population of elk, how do we get more elk? So pretty much we get more elk by elk making babies, and so certainly reproduction is a way that we get elk, but there are a lot of different features of the ecology that help us get more elk and increase reproduction. We want to have good food resources and habitat, and we want to have good nutrition for both the mothers and the offspring. We want to have large, healthy males in the population, sufficient number of males that he can mate with all the females and produce a lot of offspring, and of course, nutritious food for everybody to be successful. So we are looking at survival of the offspring, as well as looking at where the animals are moving to find out if we have enough food and habitat for our elk. They're influenced by some negative factors, which include predators, and so we're interested to study predation and mortality on the elk, and also disease. And so we have research ongoing about the disease ecology of the population, and of course ecological factors. So we certainly don't have the harshest winters here as far as elk go. There are elk that live in areas that experience much harsher winters than we do, but still long periods of wet weather are not good for the young offspring as they overwinter. So those long periods of wet weather are not going to be good for the survival of the offspring through the winter. So just a little bit of information on elk ecology, natural history. We've got the moms and their offspring, and the babies are born in a couple of weeks in May and June. They join the herd after a couple of weeks. They're weaned at just a couple of months. They start feeding on the natural greenery in the area. The young offspring grow, and after their second year, the males get their spikes. They get their larger racks after the third and fourth year, and as you know, they shed their rack each winter. The males start developing their antlers in late summer. They join bachelor groups, and then they go through the rut in early fall. Well, this rutting period is when the males compete for access to females, and then they'll hold harems. They'll guard groups of females from other males, and they'll try and mate with everybody in their group. And then they're at their prime from about 5 to 10 years old. The females stay in their herds, and their young female offspring will stay with them. And so generally, the herds of females will spend time in the same area, sort of historically and also seasonally, with their relatives and their offspring. And they're generally led by one of the older females in the group. They will experience estrus for a couple of days of the month in the fall during that rutting period. And they have a gestation period of about 8 months. So hence we get this rutting in the fall, then females get pregnant, and 8 months later, in about May or June, she produces her offspring. So if you go up to watch elk in our area in September, October, then it's very exciting, and the males are rutting and bugling and fighting. And then if you go up in about end of May or beginning of June, you'll see some of the young with their spots out there. So just to give you an idea of some of the natural history cycle of our elk. Oops, I wanted to show you this video. So I wanted to tell you about what you're seeing here. So we had a couple of callers that we put on the elk. We use GPS collars that you'll actually hear about a little bit later. And we purchased collars that had little cameras on them, like a critter cam that you might have seen National Geographic have, a little GoPro on their collar. And we were really interested to see what we could see. And so we put these camera collars on just 2 elk, and we watched a lot of this. Wait, I'm going to show you again. In case you missed it. That's what elk do a lot of the day. And that's really important for them because, like cows, they're ruminants. They eat a lot of non-nutritious vegetation, and they'll eat and eat and eat. And this has been very interesting for us. We've had a student who's been watching all these videos, thousands of them, to try and get an idea of what the elk are eating and where they are when they're feeding versus when they're doing other things and interacting with other elk. So it's been really fascinating. We'll have to report back on that another time. Okay, I think it's back to you.
So in terms of management for the department, we have broken up the state, or where we have elk within the state, into specific elk management units. So the Department of Fish and Wildlife is currently examining numbers of elk and characteristics of populations statewide. And so there's several projects going on. Right now, there's one particular project that just encompasses the northern part of the state, which is actually everything from Mendocino, so the green county right there, north and east. This particular portion of the project is only the Northwestern Hunt Zone, so it's only Del Norte and Humboldt counties. The cool thing about where we are, so I told you earlier there's almost 6,000 estimated Roosevelt elk in the northern part of California. We have about 1/3 of those elk here. Those estimates, however, they're okay. It's based upon limited survey data. And so we look at harvest data, we look at counts, and we come up with a population estimate. Because of the concern that we have in this area from hunters as well as private property owners that are experiencing damage from elk, we initiated this pretty large-scale project. And so we really want to know how many elk are there really out there, and what are the characteristics of those populations. So the Coastal Elk Project. So there's kind of a reason we don't have really good estimates right now. If you think about Northern California, well, it's steep terrain, there's redwood trees. So how do people normally survey for elk? They fly, and they have visibility. If you fly, let's say bighorn sheep in the middle of the desert, you can count them easily. In places like Montana, you can fly and look for large game, and you can see them. We don't have that option here. There is a very small portion, though, of Humboldt County and Del Norte where you can visualize elk from roadways. So they're along the 101 corridor. The land is flat, the elk are habituated, you have visibility. So traditional survey techniques, so aerial surveys don't really work. And road surveys only work on a very minimal part of their range in this portion of the state. So we're gonna try to come up with some innovative techniques to proceed. And so as I said, main purposes of this project are abundance. So how many elk do we have? And what are their population characteristics? So that includes subherd identification. So is it one large group, or is it split up into several small subgroups? Habitat use, which is kind of Adam's realm, he'll talk about later, and movement, and then calving ecology. And one really important thing about that is recruitment. So how many baby elk are getting added into the population each year, and are they surviving to become a year old? And if so, what is the growth rate of that population? And so that's Erin's work. All right, on to abundance. So as I said, aerial surveys don't really work. And we do have a small portion of Humboldt and Del Norte counties where you can drive. And so that's where road surveys come into play. We also have some other tools that we're trying to utilize. One of those is utilizing cameras. So we put remote cameras out in the woods, in locations where we can't drive and see elk, locations where we can't fly and see elk, and hopefully we can capture them on these trail cameras. The other option is really exciting, fecal DNA mark recapture, which Micaela will touch on that and explain that in depth. So the road surveys, we actually started this in 2016. So when I came on, I was like, well, I don't have collars, I can't fly, but I can start driving and I can start looking at these elk and I can count them. And the information I can get from that, I can tell you where the groups are, I can tell you how many bulls, how many cows, how many calves exist in each one of those groups, and the location of where they're at. Did I just say location? And group numbers. So we established 11 routes. So as I said, they're all along the coast, so we're missing a large portion of our population, but 277 road surveys completed to date with over 561 observations on 20 distinct groups. So we've gotten a ton of data. So road surveys are good when our elk are on the road. Most of our elk aren't on the road, so we rely on these other techniques. So we put some cameras up in Del Norte County in the woods, and I was amazed at the number of videos that we got of our elk. And so what we're trying to do is mirror that project down in Humboldt County right now. So in areas where there's minimal road access, where there is steep terrain, it's forested, you don't have visibility, this stuff is coming in pretty handy. So I'm gonna try to press play on
Sound also, do they make?
There is sound on this, yeah.
What time of year is that?
That would have been 5/21.
So they're in velvet then?
They're in velvet,
Okay.
yeah. And then I'll hand this over to Micaela for the fecal DNA.
I get to come up with the really nice pictures of poop. Okay. So this, if you haven't heard many of our wildlife talks, getting information from SCAT there's just a huge amount of information that you can get from SCAT. So I've worked for about 20 years studying wildlife, and this has been an amazing tool that I've used with all the species that I've worked with from back in the day, across continents and so forth. So I'm gonna spend a little time talking about SCAT. So you may be familiar with traditional mark recapture techniques where if you're studying little mice, you catch a mouse, you put an ear tag, you set it free, you go out the next day and you catch some mice and you count the mice that have tags and don't have tags, and then you can get a pretty good population estimate of that population. Well, there's also mark recite where you can catch a bird in a mist net and put rings on its legs, leg bands, and then you don't have to catch it again. You can cite it, and then you can see which individuals are where, and you can get information that way. So this uses that same philosophy of capturing and recapturing individuals, except you never have to touch or see an elk. So we use SCAT as a proxy for individuals, because with new technologies, we're actually able to collect DNA off of the outside of each of these little SCAT balls, and SCAT pellets as we call them, and this can be identified as this individual. And so we will collect SCAT. Oh, I think I have it in this picture. Imagine for a moment we go out to watch a herd of elk, and then they move away. And then I collect 20 SCAT samples. So now I can determine through laboratory procedures, I can get genetic identity of each one of those elk. So now each of these elk are considered marked, right? I've seen them and I know who they are. Then I go back the next day or the next week and I capture 20 more fecal samples, of which 4 of them are marked individuals. They're ones that I know that I already captured this first time. So using a fancy mathematical formula and computers, you can find out that if this were actually the case, then I would have about 100, this is an estimate, about 100 elk in the population. So it's a really powerful tool because, I get to that map, because we have the ability to count elk without having to capture them. And capture comes with certain risks that we're willing to take because putting the collars on individuals is very informative in many other ways that you'll hear about tonight. But if we can find ways of counting populations for elk that we cannot capture, in particular for these elk in the forest that are difficult to see and difficult to capture, then we have a really powerful tool for estimating elk numbers in areas where we can't see or capture them. This is a bit of a funny map, so just bear with me. I've shared these. Rudy, my student, has produced these maps. I want you to visualize for a minute that this is the space that's used by one of our collared elk. So one of the questions we had as he went out to test this fecal mark recapture method is one collared elk sufficient for surveying a whole herd? Do we get a good representation? So we have a female who's collared, but we know from our observations that she spends time with these 30 other females. And so what this represents are high use areas in dark, and red is the most highly utilized area. And lighter blue areas are the less utilized areas. And looking if each of these circles is a place where he went to capture scat samples, is that a good representation of where the elk actually are? And so we want to use that single female as a proxy for the whole herd. And then can we go to that location for a single female and capture information on the whole herd? And he'll be defending this work, presenting this work at the university next month, but the answer is you can. So he went out and found where the elk were using area. He did a plot and collected all of the scat samples in the plot. And then we sent the samples down to UC Davis and they did the genetic identification of those samples. And we were able to see that through the fecal mark recapture, we could estimate that the number of individuals in the herds that we were watching, or the groups that we were observing, was very similar. So we kind of did a validation for this procedure. And he also did this for herds in different habitats so that we could understand, here are the elk that like to hang out by the road, and then there are elk up at the top of Bald Hills that he also surveyed in partially open prairie and woodland. And we're also looking at elk groups that spend more time in managed timberlands so that we can try and validate these methods for all of the groups in the region. And we haven't sampled the ones on the beach yet, although we do observe them. We haven't looked at their scat. And so we're moving forward with this winter by collecting additional scat samples from new herds and also trying different methods to get the best way of using the scat to count numbers of elk. I think it's back to you.
So in order to get a lot of this data, Micaela mentioned there are techniques where we don't actually have to touch them. But to get some of the data that we need to validate these sort of techniques, we need to capture them. So when we didn't start capturing until 2017, and through this past winter into 2018, we've captured 36 adult cow elk. We have marked them with ear tags and put on GPS collars. These collars are pretty cool because every 4 hours they transmit to a satellite, and I can look on the computer and I can see where my elk is moving at any given time. And during the summer, we increase the rate of transmission to every hour so that Erin has a better capacity to see their movement, to see where they've hidden the calf. So the data from the collars is pretty much helping us identify where the locations or where these elk exist. Looking at subherd identification, which will show you a map later of how important that is. Habitat use and resource selection as well.
So speaking of habitat selection, that's what my thesis is about. I'm a grad student working for Tim Bean. And so I'm trying to look at the, like we said, elk habitat selection and how the elk are using their environments. And so essentially it boils down to that fundamental question of like, why do elk live the places they live? And that's, by studying that, we're able to get an idea of what good quality habitat looks like. And so this is important for managers like Carrington because it lets us look at a variety of different things so we can see how their needs might change throughout the year. And we can also look at things like get an idea of what the potential population could be if they were using all those good habitat areas that exist up in Northern California. And so to do that, the best way to study habitat selection is to let the elk collect your data for you. And so that's where the collar comes in. Put the collar on, let the elk go, they move about the landscape, you know, living their lives, and those collars are collecting points for us every few hours. And then so they're beaming those points up to the satellite sends it to me at my computer, and I can look and see, okay, all these green dots, that's where the elk have gone. And then what I do is compare where they've gone to where was available to them. So those red dots represent sort of a random selection of where they could have gone, but we only saw them at the green dots. And so then what I want to see is what's the difference between those two sets of points. So those, the red versus the green, what's the difference? And so in order to do that, I'm looking at different environmental features and measuring the different environmental features that exist at each one of those locations. And so I had to choose different things to compare. So one of the big things, most important thing in my mind was look at the difference in land cover. So are they using conifer forest, or are they using open areas, urban areas, and look at the differences there. Also distance to road, are elk using areas maybe that are further away from roads than what would randomly be available. Distance to forest edge, slope, how steep is the terrain, if they're choosing flat areas or rugged areas, and then time since disturbance. And so I included this layer to see if elk might be responding to disturbances like a clear cut or a wildfire down in the bottom right there, and see if they respond over the years after those things have occurred. Quick video that I put together just showing some of the movements. And so each one of those dots represents an elk location, and each one of the colors is a different elk. And so it's pretty quick, but you'll see those points moving around, and just keep an eye on kind of the places they're going. And so those light green areas are like open areas, meadows and pastures, and the dark green band is like forests, like conifers and hardwoods. So I'm gonna play it and we can see where they're going.
Is this around Gold Beach or?
This is actually by Crescent City. So yeah, they're shooting around, and that's about 6 months worth of points for 5 different elk. And so you can see they kind of pretending, so quick, but you can see they were tending to stay out in those green and brown areas, those open habitats. And so when I put it all into the computer model to see what is good habitat quality look like, I looked at this whole area of Northern California. And yeah, there we are, here's Humboldt Bay. And this is what I came up with. And so the bright red areas represent really good elk habitat, and the dark blue areas are maybe not such good habitat. And so when I looked at what the model came up with, it said land cover was the most important thing in determining if it was going to be good quality habitat or not. And road distance and distance to forest edge were also important, but the main thing was land cover. In particular, it was those open areas like we saw in the video. That was really, really key for elk. And so I wanted to see what's habitat quality look like around Sequoia Zoo. There we are in the star. And so, maybe predictably the houses are probably not gonna be great, but there's some forest and there's some open areas. So this is what it looks like. A lot of blue up here, right? But there's a few patches of bright red. So who knows, maybe in time, if they can find out how to get here.
So we mentioned subherd identification and home range. So this is the home range of the elk that we have up in the Crescent City area. As you can see, we have a couple elk that extend all the way up into Oregon. And what's really interesting is that's two distinct groups up there that actually overlap. And then as you move down where it says Smith River, we initially thought it was two distinct groups. We collared what we thought were two distinct groups. Come to find out, they're really one and the same. So we caught the two individuals when they were separated for a small amount of time, but the majority of the year they're actually together. And then that's the same spot that we just saw the movement for. The area below that is actually one of the cows utilizing habitat south of there during calving. And then we have two other groups that are over on Kings Valley and down into Birch Track. So we have elk collared from the Oregon border right now all the way down to pretty much the 36. The majority of our collared elk are on the coast, but we are working to get collars further inland and on the groups that we don't have collared yet. So that way we can fill in gaps where we don't have home range and we don't have movement information.
Okay, so I'm going to change gears a little bit. My name is Erin Nigon, as Micaela introduced me this morning, or this evening. I'm one of the graduate students working on this project, and I'm focused more on calving ecology and calf survival with these guys. But before I dive into my project, I just want to take a step back and kind of dive into calving ecology a little bit more. So as Micaela mentioned earlier, these guys are typically born from mid-May to mid-June each year. Ungulates like elk or deer typically have all their calves kind of during a calving season during 1 month out of the year. Typically a cow will go off by herself. She'll separate herself from that female group that she associates with for most of the year. She'll go off by herself and she'll usually only have one calf. Twinning in elk is very rare. It usually only happens in like 1% of births. And that young, within a couple hours of being born, is able to stand up, has its eyes open, it can keep itself warm, and we as biologists like to refer to this as being precocial young, which basically just means that an animal can fend for itself a little bit when it is born. And the reason I bring this up is because this is a very important strategy for elk. They have a few different ways that they try to promote survival, and young in particular are very vulnerable to this, especially when they're first born. So being born with the ability to stand and maybe avoid predation is just one way that they deal with that. Another way that they deal with that is the fact that they're all kind of born at the same time, right? So if all your babies are on the landscape at one time and you're a Wile E. Coyote running around, you can only pick off a few of those calves. You can't eat everybody all at once. So elk take advantage of this. They also take advantage of the fact that forage is really good during the spring. So as any of you moms out there know, having a little one in tow takes a lot of energy. And these cow elk need good quality forage to be able to provide good, nutritious milk to their babies so that their babies can put on the weight that they need to survive. So that kind of gets into what I focused on with my project. I'm specifically looking at what are the estimates of calf survival in this area, and what are the factors that influence mortality for Roosevelt elk. We know, looking at different studies of different populations of elk or deer within the western United States, that juvenile survival is really variable for these guys, but that's normal. We know that babies are just more vulnerable to predation when they're super young, but this survival of their young influences what that population does in the long run. So if you're young and you survive into adulthood, you're recruited into the adult population, and a lot of your peers are also recruited into that population, you're going to have a population that's growing over time. We also know from looking at other populations that the majority of mortality happens during the first year of life. So when we're looking at estimates of survival, we want to estimate what that is, how many elk are surviving into adulthood, but we also want to look at what are the causes of mortality. And here again, there are several different things that we want to look at. So, what time were you born? Were you born earlier in the year, or were you born later in the year? If you were born earlier, your chances of survival might be a little bit higher than your peers that were born later in the summer. They don't have as much time to grow, put on all that weight, and prepare for maybe something more harsh to come in the future. Also, coupled with that, how big were you when you were born? If you were born heavier, you probably have a better chance of survival. What's predation like in the area? So think of a place like Yellowstone. You have a complete predator system. You have grizzly bears and black bears and coyotes and cougars. All of those guys would love to get their hands on a vulnerable elk calf. Versus somewhere like Northern California, where we have people and we have bears and coyotes and some kitty cats, but we don't have everything, and we have elk that are kind of intermingled with people, more urban areas. They're not necessarily out in the wilderness. Also, what's the environment like? So again, somewhere like the coast of Northern California, yeah, we get winter, but it's not as harsh as somewhere like Yellowstone, where you get a harsh winter that you have to deal with. What was that forage quality like? So again, going back to when you're first born, what's available to your mom, what's available to you as you're growing up? And then what's the human influence like? Is there a harvest season in your area? Do you live, I don't know, along Highway 101 where you're crossing the road all the time? Things like that can also influence mortality. And finally, disease. And I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on this one because most people gloss over this, but this one kind of has like a special place in my heart. Because there's a lot that we can learn by taking a look at what disease have these guys been exposed to, how dense is their population. So I talk about survival, but everybody surviving isn't necessarily the best thing either, because if you have a very dense population, you're more likely to share that disease that you have with your neighbor. So I am kind of right in the middle of my project. I'm still finishing up the field season with my project. And I started in 2017, shortly after we collared all those adult females. I went out that following spring and tagged a bunch of calves elk. And through the course of the year, I follow these guys and determine, do they live or die? So do they get recruited after a year? And do they get recruited into adulthood at that point? Or if they die, what are they dying of? So going out and conducting field necropsies, looking for any clues in the environment, and then also sending in any tissues I can get my hands on to look at what disease is going on, what did you have going on prior to death.
What's a typical birth weight?
Like 40 pounds. I have to convert it because I measure everything in kilos, but about 40 pounds-ish.
Thanks, Erin. I wanted to spend the last few minutes of the talk highlighting the excitement that we have in this really broad collaboration. So we're here representing HSU and CDFW, but we've had a lot of partners in this project. So certainly Carrington's here representing CDFW, but many members of that group have participated in helping in captures and permitting and all sorts of factors, not to mention that a majority of our funding has come from CDFW, including all the funding for these graduate students. So that's been a great support to us at HSU. California State Parks, National Park Service, and Green Diamond as landowners in the region have been really supportive of this work. They have both helped with captures as well as allowed us to work on their properties and put out cameras and bring busloads of students and do road surveys. Really, they've helped out a lot. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation has also assisted with funding. We've also had partners with tribes in the area, so we have an MOU or Memorandum of Understanding with the Tolowa-Dini Nation. We are in conversation with the Yurok tribe, we have a Yurok tribal biologist here, to talk about elk movements in the region. And so it's been really important for us to be communicating with all the stakeholders, as we call them, the people who are interested to know what's going on with elk. We're all communicating all the time about this project. I also wanted to highlight the hard work of this team. So Carrington and I kind of get the billings up here as the PIs and the professor on the project, but this work wouldn't get done without the hardworking graduate students. And so you heard from Erin and Adam. Emily, who's been doing the disease work, will present next year. And Rudy, who really kicked off this fecal DNA mark recapture that we're going to be, Carrington and I are in the process of taking on another graduate student to continue some of this fecal DNA work for this winter into next year. And then I just want to continue by saying this has also been a great project because we've been able to support even more research at HSU through undergraduate research. And that's something that we at HSU really pride ourselves on, is getting undergraduates involved in research. And so this is just a smattering of senior projects at the end of their education, undergraduate education in the wildlife program. All seniors must carry out an independent research project, and some of them come to us to work with us on the elk project. And so you don't have to read all these titles, but we've got population success and feeding, diet composition, hormone levels, looking at what's a good bait at the camera traps to bring them in, where do they like to walk, where are they spending their time when they're about to give birth. And so small projects that are really useful in helping us work. And on top of these volunteers, we have dozens and dozens of undergraduate volunteers that have gone out with us to help us with our road surveys, to help us with our captures. We have a few here tonight I'm really happy to see, so thanks for all your hard work. Kimberly's here. Are there other folks here that have helped us with our project? So it's been really nice because we've been able to get them experience working with professionals in the area and agencies, as well as doing some research so that they can go off and get good field jobs and go to grad school and do all that fun stuff.
How long does the batteries on the collars last? Do you know yet?
It depends on the collar. So the ones we have right now, they actually have a mechanism on the side that is programmed to release out after a certain number of days or weeks. And so these collars will actually drop off of the elk after 3 years. But we are getting new collars that should last 5 years. So the only stipulation with those is that they're taking less points per day. So that way it conserves battery life.
Do you capture them, put their collars on?
Very carefully. So we have two methods. One is helicopter-based captures. And so there's a crew up we actually contract with a capture crew. And there's an individual that has a net gun. So it's basically, it's a net with 4 weights on the sides, and they shoot it out of the helicopter onto the elk, and the elk gets tangled up, and they jump out and physically restrain the elk. The other way is through chemical immobilization. That's where, I come into play. So we utilize dart guns and basically stalk elk as if you were hunting, but we use immobilization drugs, and so we chemically sedate them.
And do you net them to create the 20 that you used in your sample? You had a box up there with 20 elk in it that you'd visited all of those elk. They had red X's in them, and then you followed the red X's into to measure the scat. But you started with elk that you already had examined. Is that right?
So we used one individual from that group to locate where everybody else was. So what we were assuming is that we have one caller on a group, and so everybody else is hanging out with her. And so we only, in that group, only had one individual that had a collar. Everybody else was unmarked.
Do the adult males kill the babies ever?
Not intentionally.
Okay. And do you call the adult males if there's too many in a group, or is there?
So I know other states, for management, will call populations to reduce numbers. At this time, in California, we don't have that situation.
And do they ever allow hunting, by the local population?
Yeah, so the Northwestern Hunt Zone is Del Norte and Humboldt counties. Right now, we have 45 general tags that get allocated on an annual basis.
That means one, they can get one, and that's it, so 45.
You're lucky.
Yeah.
Two questions. On the beginning, you showed a map that showed where the different elk were. You had a yellow spot where the Rocky Mountain were, but it was down in Southern California.
I wasn't aware that we showed Rocky Mountain elk in Southern California. Oh, it could have been the hunt zones. The majority of Southern California is only Tule elk. If we do have Rocky Mountain elk down there, I'm unaware of it.
Okay, it was just the coloration was on there. It was like the second map that you showed. The other thing is when you've got the trail cameras where you can catch them going back and forth on the trails, how do you know that you've got two different groups? Is there a distinguishing features from elk to elk like they do with like giraffes and zebras and things like that? Or do you just hope?
So we've had a researcher up in Redwood National and State Park that has utilized distinct markings on individual elk to do that. So they look at antler growth, and they've also looked at scars or notches in the ears to identify cow elk. We are not doing that. So what we're utilizing for the mark recapture, so when we need to have marked individuals, we're doing non-invasive techniques where we actually don't have to put hands or identify visually. We don't have enough marks in our populations to do a mark recite.
Okay.
But we are utilizing techniques with the cameras where we don't have to have any of the individuals marked at all. So it's based upon unmarked populations of elk.
Last question, and you reminded me that I wanted to ask it. most of your ear-tagged elk had two tags, one in each ear, and some in different colors. Do the tags represent certain things? Or, you know, like the year you tagged it or something like that?
So we tagged all of our cow elk sequentially. We put 2 ear tags in, so if we do see them on a camera or if we're on a road, we have the ability to, we're more likely to identify that individual, and if they rip one out, there's one left over. The different colors, we're only using white tags on our cow elk. If it is a different color, that's probably because it was darted for some other reason, so possibly a bull elk that was sedated to pull them out of barbed wire or something. And then our calf elk are being marked with little blue ear tags.
Okay.
Now, what are your current resource constraints, and what, if you have the resources, what additional can you do that you're not currently doing on your research?
Wow. I feel like we have a lot going on right now. I mean, right now we're getting ready for captures and we're deploying cameras, and we're hopeful to start another fecal DNA mark recapture study, and we're getting a graduate student on board, and Erin is gearing up to assist the department after she's done with her master's to do another season of calving ecology research. So I think the main thing that we have here is that the majority of Humboldt and Del Norte counties, it's private property. And so we're 100% reliant on the cooperation of landowners to do the work that we're doing.
Really, and previous elk work, they're really reliant on those open areas, those open prairies. And so now there are landowners, including the tribe, who are interested to bring those prairies back and clear back some of that encroaching vegetation. And about the elk themselves won't be able to clear it, but if you clear that encroaching vegetation, they'll be able to keep it back. So they do reinforce the prairies. They are our large grazer in the system and will keep the trees from coming back, but they can't do it when they're this large. Yeah. Chris?
Well, to follow up on that a little bit, you know, there are elk that are persisting in the dense forest areas on the Rock Reservation or elsewhere. Looking at habitat selection in open areas where there's good open habitat and it's relatively stable is great, but we know that the elk are going to select that. Do you guys have any plans to put collars on individuals in the forest and see how those individuals are able to persist in that kind of dense closed area where there aren't any openings?
We do, and a large project in the Marbled Mountains is getting ready, or they've started. And so that's where, instead of seeing elk up like in your oak woodlands, you're actually seeing elk more kind of in your riparian corridor along drainages.
So the idea would be we're definitely interested to survey those elk. We know they're spending time in the forest, but we're going to catch them in the open areas that we know they are. So some prairies in those forested ecosystems or some in those drainages. And using the cameras to find out where they're spending time will help us target those forest elk.
Have you found Lyme disease in any of the elk?
We have not tested.
So how do you guys go about selecting which elk you put the GPS collars on, and how does having such a thing, if you guys don't, impact their behavior in the herd or how they're...
So we normally attempt to go for the lead cow. Her behavior kind of dictates the rest of the cows, so it's better that she be marked, so she's kind of a Judas animal, so she tells us where everybody else is. In terms of the collar being detrimental, they have really large necks. These guys are big. I have noticed that initially they are a little weary about what's happened to them, and the other cows are a little interested in the jewelry, but it typically only lasts a couple of days, and they're welcomed back into the herd.
fortunate enough to live on the outskirts of Blue Lake, and we have a rather large herd. And I am on literally a wildlife highway where they go through the Cabins Ranch down my road, and I can wake up for 6-7 weeks at a time when there are elk sleeping 10 yards off my deck. It's fabulous. We go to sleep, we listen to them scream. I also have 3 horses on my property, and everybody seems to commingle okay. I have a couple questions. Number one of the things that I've noticed, when the Christies quit growing pumpkins 3 years ago, the herd became very active in moving around a lot more. And they come to my neighborhood and down the highway to get to the Essex Lake Pond, where they have a prairie and a really great water source, very little population. They plow through fences, and on our property, we have a crossbar across the top rail, and none of our fences have come down. They seem like if they can see the crossbar, they jump. And the only trouble we've ever had are with calves that can't make that leap. My question, they like, we had an apple orchard on the block, so they come and they hang and they eat apples and they rub their antlers and break the trees, but it's an old abandoned orchard, so it's very cool. My question is, the herds seem to have split, where we have a Blue Lake herd and now we have a Fieldbrook herd. And I don't know if it's the same herd that comes together occasionally and becomes one mega herd, or we have the 2 separate herds. I've noticed that in the last year or 2. And the second thing is, 3 years ago, what seemed like the largest male, who in my neighborhood nicknamed Elvis because he was a hunk of burning love, somebody poached him. They killed him, they took his horns, and they left him. Is there something we can do to help protect from human predation? It wasn't a permitted kill, it was just some horse's ass who decided to kill him because he had a huge rack. There's a new male, we call him Big Papa, and he is bigger than my 1,200-pound quarter horse. He is a huge bull. He's young, you can tell by looking at him, he's really young. And my concern is, because I'm personally involved with this herd, and on any given fall day, they actually bed down in my yard, how do we protect them? How do we keep them safe in manners that we can help?
So first, you do have 2 groups of elk, from what our collar data is showing us. So we've nicknamed, we normally name our groups based upon the property where we capture them. So we have Timmons and we have McAdams because we captured them on those
So you have
properties.
Timmons and McAdams?
We have Timmons and McAdams. So the
So
Timmons,
I was right, like, in between both of them. I'm like almost dead center between Timmons and McAdams. It seems like one herd stays in Fieldbrook proper. They're closer to the school and they go north. Which is the one that is the Timmons but goes to I mean, Timmons because of their pond,
right.
but the McAdams ones come through the ranch and down Parker Road, and then, because I live off of Parker, and then actually go over, so.
And up into Liscombe Hill.
Yeah, and up there, but it's like, they also seem like they go into Fieldbrook, so are they commingling, or what's
They
up?
probably commingle occasionally, but they are really 2 distinct groups of elk. In terms of the poaching, one of the best things you can do is call CalTip. It's an anonymous hotline, and then I would just say educate neighbors.
Much for coming.